Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our annual Research Scholars Conference 2021, being organized by Seminar Committee, Department of History, University of Delhi. The theme for this year's conference is Historical Research in the Time of the Pandemic. The aim is to encourage young scholars pursuing MPhil and PhD degree to present their ongoing historical research in the light of the pandemic, and the perspective with an added perspective of the impact of the unanticipated challenges on their research. The scholars, rather than turning to personal narratives of practical hurdles, will discuss their own historical research with more conceptually aware and historically situated ways, depicting how they have braved through the pandemic and lockdowns to continue with their research and writing. The conference is divided into 8 sessions, which will be held over a period of 2 days, both today and tomorrow. Each session will have 4 presentations of 20 minutes each, followed by a 40 minutes Q&A session. After 15 minutes, the presenter will be given a warning by the chair. Critical questions and comments are invited from our audience on Zoom as well as on Facebook. We hope to have an intriguing and interactive conference and wish all our presenters best of luck. The topic for session 1 is Religion, Art and Society and will be chaired by Professor Seema Bawa. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Arushi. This is a very, very important conference for the department, and it's been an ongoing event for about 10 years. Unfortunately, last year we couldn't hold it because of the severity of the pandemic. And it's very important for us to be able to see what our research scholars have been doing till now and others. This time it's only for the university. Usually it is for all young scholars over India, all over India. But what I find is that, despite the pandemic, despite the hurdles, I found that our research scholars, most of them have been very keenly engaged with the research. And what I really found is that the different approaches, some of them took advantage of the little periods in between where the pandemic was not so severe to do their field work. Some of them, when the archive opened, have been to the archive, and but all of them have been in touch with their research. And this is something that's very heartening for us as faculty of the department, of which we are very proud to have you all as participants and hopefully soon colleagues in various other institutions and Delhi University. So I really look forward to your researches over these 2 years. I may not be there all the time, but I'm very, very interested in that. So the first speaker today is Anchit, and Anchit has been with us from, I remember him from MA and MPhil, and now, so what I really find very interesting is how he's looking at Jain religion, temple architecture, and trying to make connections with patronage and other aspects of Jain religion, art, and society, which I'm sure he's going to present. Anchit, you have 20 minutes, right? So.
Thank you so much, ma'am. A very good morning to everyone. Please allow me to share screen. Just a second. Is my screen visible?
Yes,
is my screen visible?
Yes, it's visible.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Yes.
The winds blow too fast. The clouds neither listen or return. My country is in northern horizon. The other land lies at the western extremity. This spatial and temporal remoteness which pandemic has made us experience with our goals as well as from the days of the beginning of our individual research journeys enables us to better relate with the above lines of 8th century Korean pilgrim to India, Haicho, written while he was en route towards the western country or the western region of the Indian subcontinent, yet quite far away. I am a fortunate student of Professor Sima Baba and Professor Parul Pandyardhar and consider myself to be a person of art history background. One of the pertinent tasks which equip a student of art history is the contextualization of visual remains in terms of the cultural milieu, including the religious currents and communities, and of the political patronage, along with the study of artistic ideas and influences. The pandemic, however, deprived me of any visual exposure to the impressive monumental remains of the site I intended to work upon, that is Osia, near Jodhpur in Rajasthan, yielding around a dozen and a half of early medieval temples. This further baffled my curiosity on the reasons for emergence of a major sacred center in my own distant western country, that is the arid regions of Thar. Unlike the more fertile regions of southeastern Rajasthan, where agrarian expansion resulted in the early medieval state formation, the potential of agrarian expansion in this region has been historically minimal. This then required exploration of the local economic base, which sustained the temple construction and renovation activities for around 5 centuries. The unquarantined free research ideas induce the exploration of this question through the study of local ecology, the predominance of animal wealth in the local economy, the interregional and intra-regional nexus of trade, pastoralism, and agro-pastoralism. So while the virus restrained the research progress, the mute others, the animals like sheep, camels, goat, and cattle, came to my rescue. Thus my humble endeavor and the case study of Ocean begins to place environmental history at the juncture of art and economic history. Now, having provided a brief outline of my presentation, where I mentioned that animals would play an important role, let me begin with one more quotation from a Prakrit anthology called Vajjalaga. Do not feel distressed, O you camel, with an uplifted neck. Keep yourself alive by grazing on whatever you find. How possibly can there be trees tall enough for you in this Marusthali, which grows only thorny cactus shrubs? During some unknown century of the early medieval period, the Jain poet Jay Vallabh began to collect Prakrit gathas or stanzas on multiple topics which were already prevalent in the popular sayings or part of some older Prakrit anthologies of similar kind. The animals discussed in this anthology were quite a few, but the author could not ignore having a very generous section on romanticized gatha of camels. In the Marusthali, a term used for Thar desert, the life and livelihood of the inhabitants were much entangled with this animal, that is camel. When I could finally manage to visit Osia quite recently, I could encounter very few animals which are a result of modernization. However, I could encounter large number of sheep and goats, both in the narrow lanes of the small town and the outskirts. A small shrine of 9th-10th century of the Famsana style was located at some distance from the city center next to a water reservoir and is frequently visited by the goat and sheep herders for grazing. If you can see this figure, in contrast to the contemporary temples, the contemporary monumental temples located in the city center, this dwarf must have been commissioned by some local inhabitants for whom this landscape was of some importance. There is nothing in the modern city which could make visitors imagine that Osia would have been once a major urban center, except the large number of temples suggesting its sacred importance as an early medieval tirtha and a surviving stepwell of 8th century with very refined sculptural depictions of Gandharva suggesting presence of men and women of refined taste. While the visual remains enable one to imagine the early medieval urbanity of the site, the local epigraphical data testifies to it. Much of our knowledge of the history of the site begins only from the 8th century. This was not only the period of the beginning of prolific temple construction at the site, but also the erection of memorial stones. Large number of them were inscribed. So the epigraphic records of 8th century suggest that some form of urban character emerged at this site. We find inscriptions of some very prominent Ganika, of an aristocratic woman with royal title of Sri Ranula, and we find plenty inscriptions of corresponding to the caste of Dharkat, that is Dharkat Jati. So this was a quite affluent early medieval caste of Hindu and Jain merchants and bankers, and a 10th century inscription from Ossia itself also describes the deceased member as Vanik or merchant. Some of the 8th, 9th century epigraphic records of the deceased individuals suggest that they were migrants from some outer cities to the Ocean, revealing that Ossia was a successful economic center, at least by the end of 7th century, to have attracted these commercial migrants. The presence of commercial activities of the town during the 8th century comes also is visible from hoard of large number of diminutive silver coins unearthed at Ocean, which suggests that so it was a part of an economic exchange network that was happening between Marwar and Sindh. Sorry. Okay. So I mentioned that then this would suggest a possible role of Ossia in the trade nexus between Marwar and Sindh. Thus, a very simple answer to the question for the emergence of Ossia would be its strategic location lying on the trade route, which on its western side reaches Falodi, Jaisalmer Lodrava region, and towards Sindh. And on its eastern side, it leads towards the Mandor or Mandavyapura, the capital of the local branch of Pratiharas of Mandor, which has yielded remains from 7th century onwards, and eastward towards the Medta and agrarian regions of southeastern Rajasthan and beyond, and from Mandor downwards towards the Pali, Sirohi, and further downwards towards Gujarat. Having said this, the issue is far more complex than it appears. To what extent was the route towards west, I mean this Mandor, Falodi, Ossia, Jaisalmer, Sindh route was popular in 8th century to have enabled Ossia to benefit from its strategic location? This question is important because Jaisalmer emerged as power centers of parties only in the 11th century, and the emergence of city of Falodi is of roughly same period. Then what was the economic scenario before that period? Then, to what extent was Sindh economically engaged with Marwar or other regions? And was this route more important than other available options? So let me start by briefly looking at the economy and polity of Sindh and Jaisalmer in the period of 8th, 9th century. On the basis of Arab sources, Manad Ahmad Asif and Andrew Wink have shown that even before Arab conquest of Sindh in 712 CE, Sindh was a major urban and commercial center, and this process magnified largely with the after post the Arab conquest. Anthony Gordon O'Brien has shown that the Bhati chieftains of Sindh in 7th century were deeply involved in the desert trade after they sought alliance with the Arabs. They had significant influence in the region of western Rajasthan as early as 8th century and had significant wealth in their domain. They had stringent relations with Pratiharas marked by both matrimonial alliance and by struggle. Moreover, even before Bhatis finally settled in the Jodhpur-Lodrava region in 11th-12th century, the region for centuries was under the control of tribes Shodas and Chanas. Their inscriptions use simple titles Mahidhar for the king, which suggests that these were minor chieftains. However, surviving temple remains from the Jodhpur-Lodrava region from 8th, 9th century onwards, though which are limited in number, but suggest that there was some degree of economic success earned by these local chieftains of the Jaisalmer-Lodrava region. In my study of the temples of Jodhpur-Lodrava region, I have shown that there was a continuous flow of artistic idea to the Jodhpur-Lodrava region from eastern Rajasthan, from the centers of Marwar, and a two-way exchange between Jaisalmer-Lodrava region and the Barmer region. I am skimming the artistic comparison for the purpose of brevity, but this certainly testifies to the vibrant interregional and intra-regional exchange of artistic ideas in Thar. The artistic ideas even flowed from Marwar to Sindh. Meister has shown that the Patan Munara temple of late 9th century in the Rahimyar Khan in Pakistan had fusion of Mahamaru style of Western Indian architecture and what Meister termed as Gandhar Nagar typology of temples. Therefore, it can be safely said that a prolific trade network passed through the Mandor Ossia region to Jaisalmer and Sindh. I consider my emphasis on Mandor Ossia Jaisalmer Sindh route as important because this route was completely neglected in V.K. Jain's often cited work, Trade and Traders of Western India. He emphasized on the route from Pali, if you can see the cursor, Pali to Kidu and directly towards Sindh, which for him was the route. However, Kirdu as a major center emerged only after 10th century and would have provided access to the lower Sindh and not the middle Sindh. Rather, I have argued in favor of multiple routes between Rajasthan and Sindh, but the most popular one being the Mandor, Osia, Jaisalmer, and Sindh. Multiple exchange centers began to emerge in Ocean Mandor region from 7th century onwards, and there is no reason to believe that traders would have not followed the direct route connecting Mandor to Sindh via Osia and Jaisalmer Mandor region. Mandor also provided direct access to the Medta region in the east. This is also testified by the presence of Arab coins in the Medta region. Now, if the route passing through Osia was central to the trade nexus, the Dharkat merchants must have benefited from this network. But then the question lies, to what extent were they actively involved in the trade, and how the local power authorities of Osia would have benefited from the trade? I argue that traders and authorities would not have been able to reap sufficient economic benefits had they not cooperated with the local pastoralists, animal herders, and their animals. Scholars of medieval Marwar have repeatedly emphasized on the role of animal wealth in supporting the economy of state, which got actively engaged in the maximum utilization of the local animal wealth, which was both actively promoted and taxed. The late medieval 17th, 18th century revenue records of the state of Marwar, though could not be directly applied for the early medieval period, but could be safely used to understand the potential of the region in generating the wealth through judicious engagement with agriculture and animal husbandry. This is because the local ecology of the Marubhumi by far has not changed significantly, and nor does the composition of local animal wealth and their role in the local economy until the modern times. The state of Marwar was divided into a number of pargana and further divided into several tappas or taffas comprising several villages. The 17th century Marwar state chronicler Munot Nancy informed that significant portion of revenue realization in the Jodhpur Pargana comes from the agricultural taxes, in which the biggest share was of kharif crops. However, interestingly, amongst the various taffas of Jodhpur Pargana, the case of Osia Taffa is interesting because despite being the third largest Taffa, its contribution to the kharif was fairly limited. This indicates that even late as 17th century, the agrarian potential of the Osia region remained quite limited, though not negligible. Rather, the greatest contribution of Osia lies in its animal wealth. The late 18th century Pargana Jodhpur Hukumati Jamabandi Bhahi informs that Tafa Osia emerged as one of the biggest contributor of animal wealth in whole Pargana, being the highest contributor of camels and male buffalo, the second highest contributor of the female buffalo and bullocks, and the third highest contributor of sheep. Animals and animal products were historically major export items from Marwar, and Osia region would have been one of the biggest contributors. The high population of camels must have allowed the locals to lend them for short and long distance trade or engage in the caravan activities. The importance of animal in the medieval period is also testified by the cult of Panch Peer and the Vishnoi movement, which was largely centered around cattle protection. Now I shall gradually move towards the early medieval period. The early medieval Jain texts like Katha Kush Prakranam presents that animal rearing like that of cows, buffaloes, camel, and horse was an acceptable and respectable, not only acceptable, but a respectable profession for an householder. And it put the rearing of animal on the same level as trade. The economic potential of hiring out animals for the caravan trade is also revealed in Upamiti Bhav Prapanch Katha of roughly 9th century, as it refers to hiring out of mules and camels for a caravan trade as a profession, yielding good dividends. Interestingly, the 13th century Mrigpakshi Shastra strongly associates camel with oases and deserts or Marusthali. Undoubtedly, Marusthali was a region from which camels were associated and imported. While Marusthali itself is a broad geographical zone, the early medieval Jain texts like Satal Tirth Stotra of 1075 CE includes Osia as major tirth of Maru. So I'll return to this point on the importance of Osia a little later. Briefly, I would like to talk about the role of transit duties on caravans, which played a very important role, which was an important source of revenue for the early medieval state. a brief survey of the arid region of a brief epigraphic survey of the arid regions of Rajasthan during early medieval and of a little later period shows that in the regions which were quite arid and had limited agrarian potentials, the transit duties on caravan trade appear to have they were the important source of revenue, as the grants to the temples were quite often computed entirely in terms of the transit duties.
You have 5 more minutes, Anchit.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much. Several early medieval exchange centers emerged around the Ocean Mando region. However, the extant epigraphic data doesn't shed much information on the items of exchange in these markets of the central desert or about the grant provisions. However, there is no reason to discard the possibility of the state and cities like Ossia deriving economic benefits from the caravan passing through the route which connects Sindh and Jaisalmer region to Mandor, to eastern Rajasthan and beyond. One strong evidence in support of such a caravan trade comes not from the literary record, but from a local visual record. A 12th century epigraph from a 12th century relief from a terrace of a 7th, 8th century temple on a summit of a rock at Mandor shows have a large visual space occupied by the depiction of camels in various activities, drinking water from reservoirs, having a water wheel, giving right to soldiers, pulling the cart, etc. The depiction of animals, unless part of some narrative scenes, are strictly structured by faithful repetition of classical motifs, animals like elephants, lion, vyala, etc. However, the central visual space given to camels in this relief conveys an entangled relation of the habitats of the region and of the state and the existence of camel-based caravan trade through the Mandor-Ossia region, and hence celebrated in the relief. It was previously highlighted that Tafa Ossia had the highest population of camels in all of the whole of the late medieval Jodhpur Pargana. This relief thus also alludes to their volume in the region around Ossia during the 12th century. Moreover, there is no reason to suggest that camels were not present in the region in the preceding centuries as well. To conclude, merchants of Ossia thus seem to have derived their benefits by lending the abundant animal wealth for the caravan trade, which moved across several regions of Western India, also through trade of animals of various grade and species, and also of animal products like ghee, wool, milk, leather, etc. A 12th century inscription from the Sachia Devi temple of Ossia fixes the salary of priests in specific amounts of ghee and pulses and moon. Apart from that, the region on the west of Ossia had abundant salt reserves, which has been historically a major commercial and popular product of Marwar, and medieval records eloquently testifies to its importance to the state. At the same time, merchants of Ossia derived benefits from the strategic location on trade route connecting Sindh Jaisalmer region to the region east and south of Mandor. However, for conducting these activities, investing in animals, their upkeep, breeding, and trading in animal products, they required a close alliance with local pastoralists, without which these operations were not possible. The early medieval Thar appears as an economically and culturally vibrant zone, and if traders and merchants played important role in this vibrancy, this was possible due to the animal wealth of the region, and pastoralists could not manage, without whom this could not be successfully managed. While pastoralists never appeared in the literary and epigraphic records of the period, it was because of them and their animals that the culture of Thar could emerge, and so does the state, cities, and temples like that of Ossia. Thank you.
Thank you, Anchit, for that presentation and also for sticking to the time limit. We will take questions after all the sessions are over. So now the next speaker, the next speaker is Sandeep Sharma, and he's going to talk about Kushinagar as a modern pilgrimage center and its connection. So we are going to see a kind of an arc which is going to connect the origins of an important pilgrimage center for the Buddhists and how that's being understood today and through all the kind of intervening stages. So Sandeep, over to you. 20 minutes, remember.
Yeah. Hello.
Yeah, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Good morning to everyone. Mm, So I am going to present documenting the development of Kusinagar as a modern center of Buddhist pilgrimage. As we know that Kusinagar is important center of Buddhist pilgrimage presently, and this site has rediscovered in early 19th and late 18th century by the British archaeologists, and several antiquity are reported by them, and which prove that the site was the Mahaparinirvan place of the Buddha. So historically, Kusinagar has very important importance culturally and archaeologically, and historically, no doubt this has very important episode in the history of early India. So now the my concern is to discuss the recent episode in the history of Kusinagar. What happened in 18th and 19th century to develop the site. As we know that after the rediscovery of Kusinagar, several endowments, religious endowment made by Asian and Southeast Asian elites and follower of Buddhism. In the decade of 1890s and 90s, Kusinagar got attention of Buddhist revivalists along with a scholar and archaeologist. A Buddhist monk first made his donation to build a dharamsala in Kushinagar for the Buddhist monks and pilgrims. And that dharamsala was completed in 1895. When the construction of the dharamsala completed, then this was very helpful for the pilgrims of Sri Lanka, Myanmar, and other Asian, Southeast Asian nations who started visit at the site. In the 90s, 90s and 11, the site was excavated again by Hiranand Sastri, in which several significant archaeological antiquities were reported related to the ancient Kushinara. During this period, 13 Dalai Lama Thupten Gyatso visited Kusinagar and paid homage to the Buddha and rested in the Buddhist Dharamsala erected by earlier by Chandramani and Mahavir. According to Brigitte Kalmar, the first Tibetan visit to the real site of Kusinagar was in fact a very important one done by 13th Dalai Lama and his party in 19th century. During the first of the 20th century, knowledge of the discovery of the real site gradually spread among Tibetans. The earlier Tibetan associated a place named Hezo in the valley of Brahmaputra, Assam, as Kusinagar on the basis of their oral tradition. It is remarkable that many Tibetan monks and some Lama made their visit to Hezo from 16th century, but when original Kusinagar was excavated and the past of site revealed by Hiranand Sastri and earlier British archaeologists, the Tibetan felt an unfortunate mistake with Hezo. And other, after rediscovery of the original Kusinagar, the Tibetan started their pilgrimage at the original site that is situated in the eastern part of Uttar Pradesh. The decade of 1920s is very significant in the recent history of Kusinagar. The Burmese Buddhist monk named Khizari, who was residing at Kolkata at that time, offered the donation or restoration of Buddhist temple and remains of Kusinagar. Before this donation, he had already made donation for the physical development of the Kusinagar. Chandramani was working tirelessly to develop the site in a multi-dimensional approach, and he established an educational institute related to the language and Buddhist philosophy. K.N. Dikshit, who was the superintendent of Archaeological Survey of India during 1920s, he wrote a letter to the Secretary of UP government to allot some budget for the protection of the monument and remains of the Kashia. In 1927, a Buddhist monk from Burma named Upokyu and Yupo Hleng made religious donation to conserve the Mahastupa of the behind the Mahaparinirvana temple and also made several donations to develop the Burmese monastery complex. Bhikkhu Chandramani, who was very deeply engaged in the development of site, started the Buddha Jayanti celebration at the site, which became very significant episode in the recent history of Kushinagar. In the decade of 1930s, a Tibetan scholar visited Kushinagar and documented the site and their material remains, and documented well in his guidebook for the pilgrims and other scholars who can observe after the visit. In the year 1948, marked the visit Burmese Prime Minister Tang Kin New at the site, who was in India for a diplomatic meet in New Delhi. Meanwhile, this time, Constituent Assembly of India, some questions were asked by Satish Chandra to develop the site according to the cultural importance, monastery and monument of Kushinagar. The Department of Archaeology and then was working under the Department of Higher Education and Health, assigned the Commissioner of Gorakhpur to direct local authority for the sanitation work around the stupa and monastery, and several work taken by the concerned authority. After the freedom of India, the new formed government, many concerns were raised by many personality and social reformers and other archaeologists to preserve and develop the Kushinagar. Baba Raghav Das, who is also known as the sometime Purvanchal of Gandhi, he also became the parliamentarian after the formation of new Indian government. He raised several questions regarding the Kushinagar, and he requested to government for the establish a central museum for the preservation of material remains and other archaeological antiquities in the museum, and approach road. And this is interesting, that time he requested government to establish a Asian language institute where Indian student can learn the several Asian language for the several guides and pilgrims who want to make visit in at Kushinagar. Discussing the cultural and historical value of Kushinagar, Baba Raghav thought that Kushinagar needs a museum as Sarnath and other site had. He suggested that Kushinagar and this site may be a great factor to attract the Asian nation. This is remarkable that after independence, India was facing both political and economic problem to connect the Asian nation. In the reply from the government side, the director of ASI suggested that making up road is in the periphery of Ministry of Roadways, but he promised to establish a museum. On the matter of building a museum, DGSI assured the government will establish any museum, and archaeology department will provide the material remains and related photographs of Kushinagar to enshrined in the museum. Baba Raghav Das' contribution is undoubtedly very remarkable. In 1950, the district magistrate of Devariya raised concern about the protection of both Mahaparinirvan and cremation stupa, and on his concern, DM Devariya, the A.N. Sepru, who was the secretary of UP government, wrote that local zamindar are covering the land around the cremation stupa, and that will be very harmful for the stupa. In this response, the Department of Education replied that the matter has been already taken, and after the completion of land acquisition, the area around the stupa will be protected. This was directed to the Central Archaeology Department to conserve and protect the stupa. The year 1956 marked a turning point for the Kushinagar. 200th anniversary of the birth of the Buddha celebrated across India, and the Mahaparinirvan temple, Mahastupa, and Matha Kuvar shrine of the Kushinagar took modern Eloise structure. During this time, Kushinagar was a well-known place for the Asian and Southeast Asian nation. 14th Dalai Lama Tenzin Gyatso visited Kushinagar in 1981, where he paid homage to the Buddha and inaugurated the Global Dhamma conference there. He was welcomed in Burmese Dharamsala by Gyaneshwar, and a statue of the previous master Chandramani was installed by them. In 1992 and 3, the Department of Culture, Government of UP established the Buddhist Museum and Kusinagar, and the several antiquities and material remains were conserved and protected inside the museum. And this time very important for the Kusinagar, when the Gorakhpur University conducted a contextual archaeological investigation at the site, and they excavated the Fazil Nagar and associated that site with the Nirvana place of the Mahavira. After the unique efforts of Gyaneshwar, the project of Burmese Pagoda, also known as the Myanmar Pagoda, in 1997, this pagoda completed, and the monastery complex also provided several land for the facility for the pilgrims and local communities. This monastery is also actively engaged to provide the several social facilities for the local communities of the Kushinagar, like education, medicine, and other facilities. After the engagement of several Asian nations with Kusinagar, several temples were made at Kusinagar. For example, we can see the Royal Thai Monastery, the Burmese monasteries, Linson Chinese Vietnamese Monastery, Indo-Japanese Sri Lankan Monastery, Tibetan Monastery, and Korean Monastery. These monasteries are acquired land from Indian government and started their services like religious and other services for the local communities in their periphery. One of the important project, Maitreya Buddhist project, was introduced by Lama Ese of Foundation of Preservation of Mahayana Tradition, and the MOU was signed in 2014 between government of UP and the project director, and this project was inaugurated by then Chief Minister Akhilesh Yadav, and the work of Maitreya Buddhist project was continuously working, but suddenly in 2019 the MOU was cancelled by newly formed government led by Yogi Adityanath. And what is the reason behind the cancellation of this project is unable to find, but I have filed RTI to get the information why they cancelled the MOU of Maitreya Buddhist project, which was very multi-dimensional project, and this project was very conceptually very strong, which was a concept of university, universal medical facility center, and other medicinal activities at Kushinagar. But through we can see the MOU cancelled. Through the media reports, I tried to collect the information, and from two aspects. When we go through the aspect of government, I saw that government was saying that the work of Maitreya Buddhist project was very slow, and they are not working as they have promised in MOU. But when I tried to reach the Maitreya Buddhist project official, they tried to say that they are working continuously, but unfortunately, why government cancelled this project? But I have filed RTI, but the government and concerned department are still not providing me the exact information. My reply, their reply is just moving from one department to other department. So basically, this I tried to discuss the recent episode in the history of Kusinagar by British. Is currently Kusinagar situation is as international center of Buddhist pilgrimage, and these are the some pictures which depicts the earlier excavation made by British archaeologist and Hiranand Sastri. This is the Mahaparinirvana stupa and temple during 1950s. And this is newly constructed temple over the ancient shrine. This is colossal statue of the Buddha, which is enshrined in the museum and Mahaparinirvana temple. And this is the stupa behind the Mahaparinirvana temple, the ruins of monastery just in front of the Mahaparinirvana temple. And this is the important seal which depicts the Mahaparinirvana or Bhikshu Sangha and Mahamukutbandha Chaitya. This seal reported from the monastery after the excavation of Hirananda Sastri, and this stupa was erected by Mallas of Kushinagar, and several material remains revealed from Mauryan to Gupta period. And this is the Burmese pagoda and the monastery complex where we can see the Eloise pagoda made by religious donation from Burma and the several Buddhist followers all over the world. And this is Linson Chinese Vietnam Monastery, which is built by the donation of Chinese follower of China and Vietnam Linson organization. And this is very remarkable that these monasteries are not only providing the religious facility and religious practices, but actively these monasteries are providing the several opportunities for the local periphery of Kushinagar. For example, these monasteries are conducting educational facility where the local communities can get education and several medical facilities. This is the aerial view of Royal Thai Monastery. This is under the Thai embassy.
Sandeep, you'll have to wrap up. Okay.
This is the Korean monastery, which is not completely built, but the work is going on. Thank you, ma'am.
You can conclude. You can give one or two concluding remarks about your research. Yes.
So this paper was an attempt to discuss the recent episode in the history of Kushinagar, what happened after the rediscovery made by archaeologists and what happened after the religious donation made by several Buddhist followers and religious institutions. But this is very important that Maitreya Buddhist project, which was a dream project of Lama SA of Mahaparinirvana Foundation, this project, the cancellation of this project is very unfortunate, because through this project, Kushinagar can get several facilities at the site, but government cancelled this project in the name of integrated Buddhist circuit at the site area. And currently in the previous month, they have inaugurated the international monastery to connect the several Asian nations very easily. But the cancellation of this project is very unfortunate. And I will try to get all the information regarding this cancellation and try to complete this paper. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sandeep, for that. Our next speaker is Shyamjit Yadav, who's going to speak on the Shaiva Siddhantas. Yes. So if you can stop presenting, you have to press stop presenting. Sandeep? Can anybody tell Sandeep to stop presenting so that the next? Yeah, okay. Thank you so much. Yeah, so Shyamjit is going to be speaking about Shaiva Siddhanta in Central India. Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you. Shyamjit, you have 20 minutes, right?
Yes. Yes,
I'll remind you after 15 minutes.
Yes, ma'am. Good morning, ma'am. मध्य भारत में शैव सिद्धांतिक मत का योगदान। सामाजिक संदर्भ। इंट्रोडक्शन। शैव पंथों ने प्राचीन और आरंभिक मध्यकालीन भारत के सांस्कृतिक और धार्मिक विकास में एक महत्वपूर्ण भूमिका निभाई है। सदियों से साहित्यिक और अभिलेखीय स्रोत आधुनिक मध्य प्रदेश के शिव संप्रदाय के बारे में हमें मूल्यवान ऐतिहासिक जानकारी देते रहते हैं। इस काल के धार्मिक और सांस्कृतिक विमर्श को समझ पाते हैं, बल्कि इन संप्रदायों के संस्थानगत आयामों को जानने में भी हमें मदद मिलती है। सांस्कृतिक विमर्श और सामाजिक और अनुष्ठानिक प्रक्रिया को समझने का प्रयास करेंगे। साथ ही साथ सैद्धांतिक दर्शन के ऐतिहासिक कालक्रमिक विकास को समझने की भी कोशिश करेंगे। सैद्धांतिक कौन थे? मध्य प्रदेश के शिवपुरी जिले के रानो शिलालेख में तपस्वियों मुनि वंश की शुरुआत और विकास का वर्णन है। इन ऋषियों को सिद्धांतिक के रूप में वर्णित किया गया है। ये उपाधि इन तपस्वियों की सांस्कृतिक पहचान के रूप में देखी जा सकती है और शैववाद के शैव सिद्धांत संप्रदाय के प्रति उनके विश्वास को चिन्हित करती है। इस संप्रदाय की शुरुआत उत्तरी मध्य प्रदेश में हुई, जहां 675 ईस्वी में कदवाहा में कदम गुहादिवासी की स्थापना के साथ इसकी शुरुआत हुई। इन तपस्वियों मुनीन्द्र, यति, नाथ, पाल, अधिपति, स्थानपति, स्थानाधिकृत की पद्धति लंबे समय तक चली। ये संप्रदाय गुरु शिष्य परंपरा का निर्वहन करते हैं और इसी परंपरा के अनुसार अपनी वंशावली तैयार करते हैं। सन्यासियों के इस वंश ने शुरुआत में अपने तपस्वियों की प्राकृतिक और लगभग आत्मदंडात्मक प्रथाओं के साथ साथ उनके संस्थागत मठवासी संगठन की अच्छी तरह से स्थापित स्थिति से अपनी प्रतिष्ठा और ताकत प्राप्त की। सैद्धांतिक और राजनीतिक प्रक्रिया। समय के साथ ये तपस्वी राजनीतिक प्रक्रिया का हिस्सा बन गए और तपस्वी प्रणाली हल्की पड़ने लगी। अब इन तपस्वियों और मठों को मिल रहे राजकीय संरक्षण से पहचाना जाने लगा, क्योंकि इसके आचार्य राजगुरुओं में परिवर्तित हो जाते हैं, जो राजकुमारों की प्रार्थना के साथ आध्यात्मिक और राजनीतिक समर्थन के लिए उनकी ओर देखते हैं। 7वीं से 13वीं शताब्दी तक गुर्जर प्रतिहारों, चालुक्यों और मालवा के बाद के प्रतिहारों और त्रिपुरी के कलचुरियों सहित समकालीन शासकों ने इन्हें सम्मान में रखा। इसके तपस्वियों और मठों ने आबादी पर नियंत्रण का प्रयोग किया, जिसमें 8वीं जंगलों में योद्धा शामिल थे। स्थानीय धार्मिक संप्रदायों को आत्मसात किया और समुदाय को एकीकृत किया। अपने तपस्वियों के नेतृत्व में मध्य भारत में यह मठवासी आंदोलन कई कारणों से उल्लेखनीय है। मठों के अपने एकजुट संघ, उनके संगठन और प्रबंधन के लिए, अपने मुनिवंश में निरंतरता के लिए, जिसे परंपरा, पौराणिक कथाओं और वंश द्वारा मान्य किया गया था। जैसे जैसे वे सत्ता में बढ़ते गए, सिद्धांतिकों ने मध्य भारत में राजनीतिक और सामाजिक आर्थिक समीकरणों को काफी हद तक बदल दिया और अधिग्रहणवादी तपस्या की एक बदली हुई संस्कृति की शुरुआत की, जो कई अवसरों पर आक्रामक और युद्धप्रिय बन गई। इसलिए सिद्धांतिकों के विशाल किले जैसे मठ आज भी उनकी सर्वोच्चता के प्रमुख दृश्य प्रतीक बने हुए हैं और कभी-कभी उन्हें प्रतीकात्मक रूप से देवत्व के स्तर तक बढ़ा देते हैं। शैव सैद्धांतिक और पवित्र स्थल। मध्य भारत में शैव सिद्धांत के उद्गम स्थलों का अपना एक इतिहास रहा है, जो तपोवनों और वनों से होते हुए शासन और महलों तक जाता है। यहाँ हमें शिव सिद्धांतिकों की सांस्कृतिक इकाइयों के दो आयाम देखने को मिलते हैं: पवित्र स्थान और उसका स्थलाकृतिक तंत्र। इस तरह के स्थानों की श्रृंखला में प्रत्येक स्थान को सिद्धांत के पवित्र क्षेत्रों को परिभाषित करने वाली एक महत्वपूर्ण कड़ी में बदल दिया गया था। शिव सिद्धांतिकों से जुड़े घटनाओं और त्योहारों का जश्न मनाया गया था और उनके मुनियों और संबंधित घटनाओं से संबंधित था। लोगों से लेकर राजकुमारों तक समाज का व्यापक प्रतिनिधित्व मंदिरों, मूर्तियों, प्रतिमाओं, मठों, अनुष्ठानों, दीक्षा आदि सहित पवित्रता के कार्यों ने इसके उत्थान और विस्तार में महत्वपूर्ण योगदान दिया। शैव सिद्धांतिकों के राजनीतिक और सांस्कृतिक स्थलों का विस्तार। शैव सिद्धांतिकों के भौगोलिक और सांस्कृतिक स्थल आरंभिक मध्यकाल तक आते आते तपोवनों से बढ़कर मंदिरों और मठों के पूरक के साथ आबादी वाली बस्तियों में बदल गए। कदम गुहा कदवाया जिला गुना के ऋषि के नाम के रूप में कदम गुहा आदिवासी को एक गुहा प्रदान किया। कदवाया को छोड़कर ये सभी बस्तियां दूर दूर तक घने जंगलों से घिरी हुई हैं और आज भी यहाँ पहुंचना मुश्किल है। और इन सभी समूह में जोड़े या अकेले में मंदिर हैं। ये कभी तपोवन, एकांत और ध्यान में तपस्वियों के आत्मदंडात्मक प्राकृतिक जीवन के लिए उपयुक्त थे। एक तपस्वी की कुल वापसी ने उसे आत्विकों की निकटता में एक निर्विरोध उपस्थिति की अनुमति दी, जिसका अधिकार जंगलों में प्रबल था। इसलिए उन परिवेशों में मुनियों का उदय आत्विकों और गैर बाध्यकारी तपस्वियों के बीच समझौते का प्रतीक होना चाहिए, जिन्होंने अंततः उन तपस्थानों को मठों में परिवर्तित कर दिया और उन्हें मंदिरों से अलंकृत कर दिया। तपोवनम श्रेष्ठ मठम विद्या प्रस्थः प्रतिष्ठा परम निनाय। यह भी देखा जा सकता है कि सिद्धांतिकों के पवित्र स्थान बार बार युद्धों से तबाह हो गए थे। इन स्थलों के पवित्र चरित्र को अक्सर घुसपैठ जुझारू प्रकरणों द्वारा रौदा जाता पाया जाता है। तेराही ने 903 ईस्वी में एक खूनी युद्ध देखा, जब एक भीषण लड़ाई में योद्धाओं की जान चली गई। उनकी पत्नियों ने सती की और उनके स्वर्गारोहण का जश्न मनाने के लिए स्मारक पत्थर स्थापित किए। शैव सिद्धांतिकों का भौगोलिक विकास। मध्य भारत में शैव सिद्धांत का इतिहास इसके उत्तरोत्तर विस्तार का इतिहास है, क्योंकि यह पहले उत्तरी, दक्षिणी, पूर्वी और मध्य प्रदेश 7वीं से 13वीं शताब्दी ईस्वी में व्यापक रूप से विकसित हुआ और फिर राजस्थान 960 ईस्वी, उड़ीसा और महाराष्ट्र 10 या 11वीं शताब्दी ईस्वी, आंध्र प्रदेश 1234 से 1291 ईस्वी और तमिलनाडु 11 से 14वीं शताब्दी ईस्वी तक फैल गया। यहाँ हमारी चर्चा केवल मध्य प्रदेश में इसके विकास तक ही सीमित है। सिद्धांत आंदोलन की पवित्र स्थलाकृति का वर्णन रानोद शिलालेख में इसके उत्तरोत्तर विस्तार वाले स्थान और इसकी कई शाखाओं विपुल वर्धित भूरी शाखा के संदर्भ में किया गया है। शिलालेख अन्य बातों के साथ साथ तपस्थान, तपोवन, आश्रम, बस्ती आदि में इसकी उपस्थिति को इंगित करता है। मठों का विस्तार। सिद्धांत आंदोलन का विस्तार पवित्र स्थान केवल प्रदेश तक ही सीमित नहीं था, इसमें लोग भी शामिल थे। क्षेत्र के संदर्भ में इसका नियंत्रण जंगलों से लेकर दूर की भूमि तक फैला हुआ था। लोगों के संबंध में इसने लोगों से लेकर शासक राजकुमारों तक समाज के एक व्यापक प्रतिनिधित्व को अपनी तह में शामिल कर लिया। क्षेत्रीय विस्तार में फिर से आंदोलन स्थानिक रूप से अस्पष्ट या गैर निश्चित क्षेत्रीय संस्थाओं में शामिल नहीं रहा। यह विशिष्ट स्थान और उनके वातावरण को अपनी चपेट में लेता चला गया। निकट या दूर के स्थानों में विशेष मठों के तपस्वियों के प्रवास ने इसके विस्तार को सहायता और मजबूत किया। चूंकि सिद्धांतिकों ने उत्तर में मुरैना जिले से दक्षिण में गुना जिले तक फैले क्षेत्र में अपनी मठवासी बस्तियों की स्थापना की, यह विस्तार 7वीं और 10वीं शताब्दी के बीच हासिल किया गया था और इसे मंदिर के पूरक के साथ आगे बढ़ाया गया था, जो प्रत्येक बिंदु पर आए थे। वह स्थान जहां सिद्धांत ने मूल रूप से एक मठ के साथ खुद को स्थापित किया था, मूल रूप से एक मठ के साथ स्थापित हुआ था। इस प्रकार कला और स्थापत्य कला ने सिद्धांतिकों के विनियोजित स्थानों को अत्यधिक प्रकृति और अर्थ के साथ निवेश करने में काफी हद तक महत्वपूर्ण भूमिका निभाई। मध्य भारत में सिद्धांत आंदोलन और कला इस प्रकार प्रतीत होती हैं, एक दूसरे को एकीकृत और मजबूत करने के साथ निकट एक भाव में विकसित हुए हैं। यह 7वीं से 10वीं शताब्दी तक मठ और मंदिरों जैसे स्मारकों के संदर्भ में है। ये मठ हैं जो कि कदवाया, सुरवाया और रनौद के हैं। बेसिकली रनौद और सुरवाया मठ हैं। तेराही और रानौद मठ। कदवाया, सुरवाया, रानौद और तेराही में मठों का क्रमशः क्रमिक रूप से निर्माण हुआ। ये मठ कदवाया में एक को छोड़कर स्वयं सिद्धांतिकों द्वारा बनवाए गए थे और एक गुरु शिष्य परंपरा का निर्वहन किया था। रानौद शिलालेख के विवरण से संकेत मिलता है कि अवंती वर्मन चालुक्य 825 शताब्दी ईस्वी ने अपनी राजधानी में एक मठ का निर्माण किया और पुरंदर को रानौद अरणी पद से वहां रहने के लिए आमंत्रित किया। पुरंदर ने, ये सब पुरंदर और ये नाम है शैव आचार्यों के हैं, गुरुओं के। अरणी पद से वहां रहने के लिए आमंत्रित किया। पुरंदर ने उनके लिए बनाए गए मठ कदवाया पर कब्जा कर लिया और रानौद में एक और मठ का निर्माण किया, जिसे उन्होंने अपने शिष्य कवच शिव को सौंप दिया। इसलिए ये दोनों मठ लगभग 825 ईस्वी के आसपास के माने जा सकते हैं। कदवाया का पवित्र इतिहास 675 शताब्दी ईस्वी से लेकर विक्रम संवत शताब्दी ईस्वी से लेकर के विक्रम संवत 1587 तक है और अभिलेख इसकी गवाही देते हैं। इसकी पवित्रता और तीर्थस्थल के रूप में इसकी स्थिति। सिद्धांत यहाँ 973 ईस्वी तक फलता फूलता रहा। 825 ईस्वी और 973 ईस्वी के बीच इसे कम से कम 5 मंदिरों, 4 मठों, 6 पवित्र तालाबों एवं दीवार वाले 4 दीवारी कुओं और बगीचे से अलंकृत किया गया था। यहाँ बने मंदिर शिव, उमा, नटेश और विनायक को समर्पित थे। इनमें से केवल एक मठ और खूबसूरती से बनाया गया एक तालाब वापी ही बचा है। सुरवाया को 700 ईस्वी में शंख मठकाधिपति द्वारा अपने कब्जे में लिया गया था। ऐसा लगता है कि इसका मठ 8वीं शताब्दी के अंत या 9वीं शताब्दी की शुरुआत में बनाया गया था। इसे आगे 1292 ईस्वी तक एक किलेबंद परिसर में बंद कर दिया गया था। वर्तमान में मठ अपने गढ़ों, मकबरे और द्वारों के साथ किलेबंदी की एक दोहरी रेखा में घिरा हुआ है, जिसने मिलकर इस पूरे परिसर का निर्माण किया। तेराही तिराम्बी पाल 725 ईस्वी के साथ सिद्धांतिक नियंत्रण में आया। यहाँ का मठ 9वीं शताब्दी में उसी काल के मंदिर के साथ जुड़ा हो सकता है। 13वीं शताब्दी में तिराम्बी मठ के एक तपस्वी उड़ीसा चले गए और उन्होंने इसका उल्लेख उत्तर तेराम्बी ग्राम के रूप में किया। उसके बाद तेराही के बारे में कोई ऐतिहासिक अभिलेख नहीं है। जैसा कि ऊपर उल्लेख किया गया है कि संरक्षक कुलराज अनुयायी प्रख्यात चंदियान की हत्या कर दी गई थी। तेराही 11वीं शताब्दी का मोहाज माता मंदिर इंगित करता है कि यह स्थल कम से कम उस अवधि तक प्रमुखता में रहा। शैव सैद्धांतिक मठ। मधुमती, महुआ जिला शिवपुरी में भी एक सिद्धांत मठ मौजूद था। ऐसा प्रतीत होता है कि यह 7वीं शताब्दी में शिव धुर जाति को समर्पित मंडपिका मंदिर के निर्माण के साथ प्रमुखता में आया। उसी शताब्दी का एक शिव मंदिर और एक चामुंडा मंदिर 9वीं शताब्दी ईस्वी भी अस्तित्व में आया, जो मध्य मयूर शाखा के तपस्वियों के लिए प्रसिद्ध था। महुआ में आज कोई मठ मौजूद नहीं है, लेकिन इस जगह का उल्लेख सिद्धांतिकों के निवास मधुमती धाम सैद्धांतिका नाम के रूप में किया गया है, जो वहां एक प्राचीन मठ की उपस्थिति का संकेत देता है, जहां तपस्वी रहते थे। भारतीय मंदिर शैली। उत्तरी मध्य प्रदेश में मंदिर वास्तुकला एक मजबूत परंपरा का प्रतिनिधित्व करती है, जो चरित्र में अत्यधिक एकीकृत है। यह ऊपरी भारतीय शैली लैटिन मंदिरों को दर्शाता है। पूरा लेख साक्ष्य केवल महुआ में धुरजाति शिव के मंदिर और ग्वालियर में नवदुर्गा कार्तिकेय मंदिरों, अब नष्ट हो गया है दुर्गा कार्तिकेय का मंदिर, के मामले में उपलब्ध है और यह उनके गुर्जर प्रतिहार संबंध को इंगित करता है। ऐसा वंशवादी जुड़ाव अन्य जगहों पर पूरी तरह से नदारद है। तथ्य यह है कि इनका निर्माण मधुमती, तेराही, बटेसर, नरेसर सहित अन्य स्थलों में किया गया था। उनके निर्माण और अभिषेक में सिद्धांतिक संरक्षण की ओर संकेत करते हैं। शैलीगत विचारों पर इन मंदिरों को कालक्रम के अनुसार 600 ईस्वी से 10वीं शताब्दी ईस्वी तक प्रारंभिक, परिपक्व और गुर्जर प्रतिहार समूहों में वर्गीकृत किया गया है। यह काल मंदिर वास्तुकला और कला के क्षेत्रीय शैली की दृढ़ स्थिति को चिन्हित करता है, जिसे विभिन्न रूप से प्रतिहार, महागुर्जर आदि नामों से भी जाना गया है। इन मंदिरों के ये मंदिरों की कुछ सूची है। 7वीं शताब्दी में जो मंदिर निर्मित हुए थे, महुआ धुरजाति मंडपिका, महुआ शिव मंदिर 8वीं शताब्दी ईस्वी में निर्मित मंदिर हैं, जैसे नरेसर शिव मंदिर समूह, बटेसर शिव मंदिर समूह, खेरहट देवी मंदिर, अमरोल रामेश्वर महादेव मंदिर, इंदौर शिव मंदिर, दांग शिव मंदिर, अमरोल दाने बाबा का मंदिर, बटेसर भूतेश्वर महादेव मंदिर, महुआ चामुंडा मंदिर। मंदिरों की सूची और आगे, ग्वालियर विशाख मंदिर वर्तमान में अब ये उपलब्ध नहीं है। केलधर सूर्य मंदिर, ग्वालियर तेलिका मंदिर, ग्वालियर नवदुर्गा मंदिर वर्तमान में ये भी उपलब्ध नहीं है। केलधर एक शिव मंदिर, तेराही शिव मंदिर, 10वीं शताब्दी ईस्वी में सुरवाया शिव मंदिर, कदवाहा शिव मंदिर समूह, पढ़ावली मंडप, थोबोन शिव मंदिर। ये कुछ कदवाया और तेराही के टेम्पल्स हैं और सारे टेम्पल्स के जिसमें हमने अभी आपको डिस्कस किया है, मेरे पास सारे फोटोग्राफ्स हैं जो कि दूसरे फाइल में हैं। ये मुरायता एंड कदवाहा टेम्पल्स हैं। मंदिरों की शैली व स्वरूप, सॉरी
शांतजीत 5 मिनट और हैं, ठीक है?
जी मैम, जी मैम। ये महुआ एंड तेराई टेम्पल्स हैं और नरेसर जो मंदिर समूह है उसके विषय में एक पर्टिकुलर सदाशिव की एक छवि शिव को चतुष्पाद के रूप में चित्रित करने में सिद्धांतिक दर्शन को संक्षेप में शामिल करती है। उनके 4 पैर ज्ञानपाद, क्रियापाद, योगपाद और कार्यपाद को दर्शाते हैं। विचाराधीन छवि एक लिंगम के एक तरफ खुदी हुई है, जबकि दूसरी तरफ देवता के 3 अन्य आकृतियां हैं। यह मध्यस्थता में बैठे 2 सशस्त्र देवता का प्रतिनिधित्व करता है और इस मायने में अद्वितीय है कि इसके आसन को 2 अतिरिक्त पैरों और 2 अतिरिक्त हाथों से घेरा गया है, जिसके पैर अपने चतुष्पाद बिंब विधान को समय के साथ पूरा करते हैं, जो कि निरूपण के तरीके में अतुलनीय है। जीव पशु पर शिव का पूर्ण नियंत्रण इसी तरह उसी शिवलिंग पर अन्य आकृति में भी दर्शाया गया है, जहां शिव अपने एक हाथ में एक हिरण रखते हैं। जीव यहाँ हिरण जीव मतलब हिरण को पकड़ना उन बेड़ियों पास का द्योतक है जो उसे बांधती है, जिस पर शिव का अप्रतिम नियंत्रण है। सिद्धांत का दर्शन पशुपति और पास पर उसके कथनों के इर्द गिर्द केंद्रित है। ये नरेसर टेम्पल कॉम्प्लेक्स है, जैसे इसमें लकुलिस को यहाँ तपस्या दिखाया गया है। सिद्धांत धर्म संप्रदाय जो हमारा धीरे धीरे अपने इसकी मेन बातों की तरफ, सिद्धांत धर्म संप्रदाय बाद के चरण के कदवाहा, थुबोन और अन्य स्थलों के मंदिरों में विशेष रूप से 10वीं शताब्दी के दौरान और बाद में कई गुना बढ़ गया। लेकिन मातृका गणेश दिक्पालो वैनायकी अपनी पत्नी के साथ वैष्णव देवताओं के साथ धीरे धीरे देवालय में शामिल हो गए। तपस्वियों के आंकड़े भी मूर्ति चित्रण के शैव अभिलेखों में पाए जाते हैं। वे विशेष रूप से सुरवाया और थुबोन में महत्वपूर्ण दिखाई देते हैं। थुबोन में वे देव कोष्ठकों पर अत्यधिक आरोपित हैं। सुरवाया में वे शिव मंदिर के मंडप पर एक मनोरम विविधता में स्तंभों के विभिन्न चेहरों को सुशोभित करते हैं। यहाँ जो विवरण दिया गया है वह उत्तरी मध्य प्रदेश में शैव कला की सामग्री को चुनिंदा रूप से परिभाषित करता है। ये विषय संप्रदाय की प्रमुख उपस्थिति के अनुरूप क्षेत्र की कला पर सिद्धांतिका संरक्षण का दावा करते हैं। मंदिर, मठ और मूर्तियां इस संप्रदाय के सांचे में उपयुक्त लगती हैं। ऐसा लगता है कि संप्रदाय ने अपनी बारी पर उनका उपयोग उन स्थानों को सुरक्षित करने के लिए किया जिन्हें उसने अपने पक्ष में विनियोजित किया था। सिद्धांतिकों ने शिव की उनके एकीकृत पारलौकिक रूप में पहचान की वकालत की, जो अंततः द्वैत में जा सकता है। शक्ति को सक्रिय घटक माना जाता है। तांत्रिक कथनों में एक लंबी श्रृंखला का विचार किया गया है, जिससे शक्ति का उदाहरण स्वरूप अंतः शक्ति, इच्छा शक्ति, ज्ञान शक्ति, क्रिया शक्ति आदि इस अनुभूति को उत्पन्न करते हैं जो मुक्ति की ओर ले जाती है। इस पूरी योजना में पार्वती की पंचाग्नि तप करने वाली आकृति सिद्धांतिक तपस्या का प्रतीक प्रतीत होती है। इस प्रकार उमा सिद्धांतिक धर्म संप्रदाय के लिए प्रमुख लगती हैं। उनका प्रतिनिधित्व प्रारंभिक प्रतीकात्मकता का एक अनिवार्य हिस्सा है। उत्तरी मध्य प्रदेश के मंदिरों में योजना का ये टेम्पल्स के स्कल्पचर हैं, जिसमें पार्वती की भी है प्रतिमा।
श्याम जी तो रैप अप कर लो, ठीक है?
यस मैम, निष्कर्ष में है मेरा, शैव सैद्धांतिक मतों का मध्य भारत के सांस्कृतिक, धार्मिक और कलात्मक इतिहास में महत्वपूर्ण स्थान रहा है। शैव सैद्धांतिक समय के साथ समय के स्थान अपने राजनैतिक, सांस्कृतिक और आर्थिक रूप में बदलाव लाते रहे और फलस्वरूप इन्हें राजकीय संरक्षण प्राप्त हुआ, जिससे इनका भौगोलिक और सामाजिक विस्तार हुआ। शैव सैद्धांतिकों के धार्मिक और दार्शनिक प्रभाव ने मंदिर शैली और स्थापत्य कला को प्रभावित किया और फलस्वरूप शिव, विष्णु, मातृका आदि देवी देवताओं के स्थापत्य में उल्लेखनीय विकास हुआ। थैंक यू मैम।
Thank you so much, all the three presenters. So basically, the ideas that have come across are about how environment and political economic patronage are important for facilitating the religious development of pilgrimage centers, of art and architecture, and how these are not static categories, but keep on developing, evolving with the changing political and cultural situation. Shamjit, you'll have to stop presenting, I think, so that other people can start asking questions. Right. Now, what we're going to do is that I'm going to invite questions from people here who are present, and you can either raise your hand or you can type in the chat box and you can ask you can unmute yourself after raising hand after I call your name, or there are going to be questions from the Facebook, which the organizers of the conference will be helping us in presenting to the three scholars. So I'm now going to ask you all to raise your hands or ask your questions, because I think there have been some very significant contributions that have been made towards understanding basically how pilgrimages and regions have developed due to the kind of combination of forces, historical forces at work. So please ask your questions. And right, till people start sorting out their ideas, I have a few questions for, say, Anchit first. Anchit, you were talking about this kind of a connection between pastoralists and the development of local art, architecture, and cultural context, and you did quote some texts. So I just want to know that what kind of visibility is there of pastoralists? You say that they're not there in the inscriptions, right? But in historical archives of any kind, is there any other reflection of the pastoralists? We've seen camels, we've seen the kind of animals that we have, but what are the footprints of these?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much for this question. And this is indeed a very interesting question. And pastoralism and nomadism has very recently entered into the field of academic discussion. And as Shri Jindal Ratnagar has mentioned, that pastoralism was there, but very rarely mentioned in inscriptions, because state could never have a direct control over pastoralists. Now, coming to your question on how tangible we know about their presence. Tanuja Kotyal has pointed that the pre-Mughal Rajputs had a very dominant nomad past. If we look at the memorial stones of not from Rajasthan but little westward towards this region of Pokhran, Jaisalmer area, we find a large number of cattle raid memorials. Pastoralists were there till very recent times, till the pre-modern centuries. We don't find any inscriptional or literary records of pastoralists, but without them, the trade in animal products or the kind of taking care of animals was not possible. The region of Oceania was ecologically very suitable and conducive for the breeding of animals, and the large tracts of land would have provided the conducive terrains for that. But the traders in themselves could not, rear those animals. We need a specialized class for rearing of, for taking care of camels. And also, like when I mentioned that from the late medieval records, that we have the Kharif was a major revenue for the state. Rabi comes on the second stem, but it was quite limited in number. And in several regions of the Jodhpur Pargana, the contribution of Rabi was fairly limited. So in the region, when you have a very potential of a seasonal agriculture, the people often tend for the seasonal transhumance or the seasonal pastoral practices.
So Dr. Manisha Chaudhary also has a question maybe related to this, if she can ask.
Thank you, Razi sir. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Anchit, I just have a number of queries and too many objections to certain things what you have said right now. The first is that in the 18th century, when you say the things are shifting and ocean has declined and could be because of new things are emerging and all, you are completely ignoring the political disturbances and the developments that happened in the 18th century. So that is their entire political history to it, why ocean declined. And specifically, it did not decline only in the 18th century, but it started declining much before. Secondly, you are saying that ocean was very, very conducive for camel breeding. It was not. It was not, because even archaeological evidences have proved it very well, and it is very well established by archaeological evidences. Ocean was not for it. But yes, the location of ocean was such that there were large enough number of camels that were kept there, because from beyond ocean, people need to travel, and there it was the juncture for finding the transport. So people, the traders themselves used to finance these people to bring in the camel to help the transport, but not necessarily ocean is for the breeding. Breeding ground, the nearest is Barmer, which produced the best kind of camel in those times. And we have archaeological evidences for that as well. Thirdly, you say like transit duties and trade, right? So Professor Devra's work has extensively worked on this, and they have shown what kind of transit duties were there. And from camel, the transit duties around ocean and all these collections, the revenue state composition was nearly 22%. So on that part also, you need to see again, because those are the times which are 16th, 17th, and 18th century. They are not, we cannot apply that directly to the 8th century. You are taking inscriptional evidences for the, camel in the region, but the inscriptional depiction of camel in that region, again, I will say there are many such things, but again, it is archaeologically proved that donkey is the one which was domesticated first. Then it was bull, and last was the camel. But still, we do not find any evidence of donkey inscription where it is shown as domesticated, right? Rigved again indicates to certain hymns where they say about domestication of camel, but again, they are saying that we do not know where they are, basically. Now, Pabuji's thing, that is not there in the written form because the Charans generally only recite, but the Bhopas, who have a long tradition, they constantly are mentioning it into their Phad. At least the Phad is their evidence, which they bring to us. And they are saying that, yes, we have the Phad since 13th and 14th century. Interestingly, I will say if you go for the genome sequencing, which has been done by Liang Ming and Altamas for the Dromedari's, you will very well know when they came to, basically India. That is again, early medieval times. They clearly established in India, they are only reaching, or to say the northwestern frontier of India, they are reaching only in the 8th and 9th century, not before that.
You mean sheep or donkeys?
I'm saying camel.
Camels.
Sorry, camels. I'm only talking on camel. I'm just giving you the sequence of donkey, bull, and camel's domestication. It's just for that. Interestingly, from Saudi Arabia, again, we have the evidences where in 3000 BC, the camel was hunted, and the saddle was introduced in 1200 BC. So that's again very close to it. Yes, when they will be coming to us. And beyond that, I will say if you take the, because what I think you are using the Barmer Kiradu inscription for saying that the camel was used and domesticated. If we look at that in that sense, then the camel presence was very much there in the Himachal Pradesh during the 5th century, because there are temples in Himachal in the 5th century which indicate that camel was domesticated, and they are very much shown with the saddle. But these are mainly, what I'm saying again and again is these are the people who are traveling, they see these things, and when they come back, they put their artists to the work that please make such kind of things. So there's no, like what you are trying to problematize in your presentation is that on the environmental context, you are trying to fix it. But Ocean is like, it is there very well depicted by, this Shyam Singh Bhanot, then beyond Devda ji and many other historians who work on archaeology and then finally literary sources. They proved it that it was not at all for the camel breeding. It was mainly a trading center where many cultures came down, and a filtered notion of culture they wanted to depict through the temples because there was no other way for them to develop it. And that is the reason they never allowed the Charans and the others to grow in that particular region, which happened for the others, which are very nearby regions. Right. So you can just take these as, the pointers for your for shaping your work further. If you can reply one of like a few of them, it will be nice.
I would like to thank you so much, ma'am, for your points. Like there are six, seven things. Like, let me see how much I can answer. First, about the decline of Osia. I never mentioned that Osia declined in 17th, 18th century. Rather, the construction activities at Ocean halted by around 12th century, but there were some, the process of renovations continued, particularly for the Jain temple in 13th, 14th, and even 15th century. But there was a major decline or some kind of halt in 12th, 13th century. So I don't think I mentioned about its decline in 18th century. Now, second, you mentioned about the transit duties and the camels. So my argument for transit duties was not just based on that Barbarian inscription. If you look at several inscriptions from several sites, and I can mail you after the lecture. So in some of the inscriptions which are say in Tipali district, we can understand that transit duties are important because the grant to the temple were computed in three portions: A, from taxes on certain goods; B, from the agrarian taxes, from the agraha; and third, from the transit duties. But if we move towards more arid regions, the grant was computed, grants to the Jain temples of 12th, 13th century was computed entirely in terms of the transit transit taxes and duties. So on that basis, I've said that transit duties were quite important. Now, then you mentioned about that there is no reference of the domestication of mules. Upamiti Bhav Prapanch Katha mentions that it refers to the hiring out of mules and camels for the caravan trade. Now you mentioned about the issue of the camels, whether they came in 8th century or 9th century or they were later on. S.B. Gupta has also discussed this issue, and you have also discussed this issue in your book. I particularly feel that the double-humped camels must have declined or must have become extinct quite a long back, because Mrig Pakshi Shastra or the Vajjalaga, they describe the taxonomy of camel, but they don't mention about the double-humped thing. And even Huan Sang and Haicho, both of them were silent about the double-humped camels, but they did mention about camels a lot. And this Huan Sang mentioned that
just a minute here. How do you know that the camel that Khuntesan is mentioning is double-humped or single-humped? How you are trying to distinguish them? Because they are both mentioned as camel.
Huan Sang specially mentions that the camels are single-humped.
He specifically mentions that?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
He mentions that the camels are single-humped. And also, the Masudi 9th century mentions that the Gurjar rulers had a large population of camels with them. Hemchandracharya in the text, I think I'm forgetting the name of the text, but Hemchandracharya mentions that the Patan in the 11th century, that the outskirts of Patan was surrounded by large number of herders of cattle as well as of camels. So, and camels were part of the popular sayings, and because of that reason, they were collected in the anthologies.
When Shaleen, Dr. Shaleen Jain also has a question, and there are some other questions also. Maybe we can move on.
Sure, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Razi. Anchit, I'm so sorry I missed your presentation owing to some very poor connectivity at my end. So I don't know whether my comment would be applicable or not, because whatever sense I could make is that it's not directly related with your region of research, OSIA, but when you move beyond OSIA and when more to the western side in the region of Gujarat, right? There are lot of inscriptional data that is available pertaining to the animal herders, fine? And from there, it makes a lot of sense. The forms of the alliances these herders were making. I think you also talked about some sort of their
Sir, I'm not able to understand your question because there is. I think
it's not a question. It's not a question at all.
No,
I'm just adding
disturbing
to
your
your
voice. Can you please repeat? There is some disturbance in voice.
Shalinja, your voice is breaking.
issue. There is some connectivity issue, might be at my end. If you're getting it, it's fine. Otherwise, we'll exchange mail then in that case.
Sir, if you want, you can repeat also, sir.
Am I audible now clearly?
Yes, sir, it seems better.
See, I'm not putting any question to you. I'm just adding to you what you were saying, that in the region of OCI, you don't have any inscriptional data about the animal herders and all. But when you move beyond OCI, in the region of Gujarat, you have ample inscriptional data about the pastoralists. Fine. You also have their stone idols. You have a database, a massive database of the inscriptions that talk about these tribal getting into alliances, making some political alliances. It also, not of the camels, that I'm sure, but it talks a lot about the milch cattle. Fine. And the type of the fights that ensued amongst the various pastoralist tribes are gaining more and more towards these milch cattle. Right. So if this may help you out, bail you out further in your research, that's all. This was just an observation that I just wanted to make.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, sir. I will definitely look at it and I'll discuss this with you also. This is really helpful. Thank you.
We have a question from Shivatva. If you want to see your chat box, you can do that, Anchit. And then we'll go on to questions for Sandeep and Shamjit. All right?
I am unable to understand the question. If
this is not question, Anchit, what you are reading right now, he's just mentioning that this is the belief traditionally. I think you are taking from like what has been mentioned by one of the students, Beniwal, I believe. Yeah.
I think that we can, if there's not a question, is there any other question for Anchit? We can take questions for Sandeep next. No? Okay. Sandeep, we have, I have one or two questions, and then of course, it's also open to everybody else to ask questions from Sandeep. I was just wondering, what is the kind of genealogy of interest in Kushinagar? Because you've shown us a lot of visuals, but the connections between these are very unclear in your presentation, which I'm sure must be there in your research. So if you could kind of give us a little bit about those kind of connections that you're making with, pre-modern times also, it would be really helpful both in your research and also explaining what is your project actually about.
Hello.
Dibolia.
Yeah. Hello. Ma'am, can you please repeat the question?
What I want you to tell me, if you can, is that you talk a lot about, and you've shown us images of pre-modernity also, but you basically, of course, your paper is focusing on 19th and 20th century. What I really would like for you to tell me is how you're making connections with pre-modern remnants or memories of Kushinagar, and how this develops into the colonial, post-colonial understanding, development of Kushinagar as a major pilgrimage site for the Buddhists. So if you can kind of do that, it'll be really helpful. I'm sure you have done that, but since it's a short presentation, that didn't come across.
Yes, ma'am.
So please answer the question if you can. Sandeep? Have we lost him? Sandeep, can you hear me? Sandeep, आप मुझे सुन सकते हैं? Okay, I don't think. हाँ, बोलिए, आप बोलिए, उत्तर दीजिए.
मैम, क्वेश्चन मैं नहीं समझ पा रहा हूँ, थोड़ा दिक्कत हो रही है क्वेश्चन समझने में आपका.
Anybody else who has a question for Sandeep? Meanwhile, please be ready. हम पूछ रहे हैं कि आपने 19वीं और 20वीं शताब्दी के बारे में बात की है, लेकिन आप जब कुशीनगर के आधुनिकता से पहले के जो स्मृति चिन्ह हैं, हाँ, उनके साथ किस तरह से इन डेवलपमेंट्स का, इन प्रवृत्तियों को जोड़ते हैं, हाँ, कि किस तरह से पहले से, क्योंकि आपने हमें इमेजेस दिखाई थी, है ना, तो वो जो विजुअल कल्चर है वो किस तरह से आप इसको कंटिन्यूटी में देखते हैं, इसको एक नया ट्रेडिशन देखते हैं, तो आप क्या इसमें, क्योंकि हम देख रहे हैं कि जहां तक थाईलैंड का सवाल है तो वो अपने वाट ट्रेडिशन से उसका आर्किटेक्चरल डेवलपमेंट कर रहे हैं, जो वियतनामीज हैं वो अपने आप तरह से कर रहे हैं. तो पहले से कुशीनगर में जिस तरह या उसके आसपास के जो बौद्ध स्मारक थे, उससे जो विजुअल कनेक्शंस हैं वो किस तरह से आप उसको देखते हैं, और उसका जो ऐतिहासिक जो फुटप्रिंट है या उसका जो जीनियोलॉजी है उसको आप कैसे देखते हैं? आप समझ में आ गया?
Yes, ma'am. Actually, when the site was rediscovered by British archaeologists and they documented the archaeological data, and when this was very clear that the site is related to the Mahaparinirvana of the Buddha, several Asian nations tried to engage with the Kushinagar, and now we can see the engagement of several Asian nations through the building of monasteries, religious projects, and several institutions. And as in ancient time, the site was no doubt very significant in context of culture and history, as we know that Asoka also made their pilgrimage at site, and this is mentioned in the Divyavadan that Asoka visited at the site and made pilgrimage. Several Chinese pilgrims also made their pilgrimage at the site and documented the condition of site, and they tried to show that what was the religious practices were going on during their visit. And in modern time, when the site was clearly exposed by archaeologists and historian, this was very important to stress that the site become important for the modern Buddhist pilgrimage.
Any other questions for Sandeep? Are there any questions from Facebook? If you can.
No, ma'am, not yet.
No questions from the Facebook.
No,
So anybody has questions for Shamjit? You can also. Shamjit?
Yes, ma'am.
हाँ, आपके लिए मेरे पास तो, क्योंकि मैं तो आपका बहुत क्लोजली फॉलो कर रही हूँ, बस ये था कि जब आप पौराणिक की बात करते हैं, हाँ, कि किस तरह से ये पुराणों से जुड़ा है, तो पुराणों में क्या मठ और मठाधीश मुनीस की क्या उल्लेख आपको मिलते हैं? कोई मिलते हैं या नहीं?
मैम डायरेक्टली तो मठ मठाधीश का नहीं मिलते हैं, लेकिन सिद्धांतिकों के विषय में जैसे पाठक ने भी उल्लेख किया है और एग्जाम्पल दिया है इंस्क्रिप्शन का। जैसे उसमें उन्होंने बताया कि 4 के मिलते हैं, जिसमें उन्होंने जैसे पाठक के शब्दों को मैं एज इट इज आपको बताना चाह रहा हूँ कि उन्होंने क्या सेविज्म मतलब उन्होंने दीज स्कूल्स वेरियसली लिस्टेड द पुराण्स एंड आगम्स। उन्होंने कहा है डिस्टिंग्विशेस 4 them among the major ones including Siddhant, Saiv, Kalanal, same as Karuk, Pasupat and Kapalik with Som and Association। तो ये उन्होंने पाठक ने अपना एग्जाम्पल दिया है मैम इस तरह से।
Are there any questions for Shamjit or for anybody? Sandeep, Anchit, anybody? Anybody, or if there are questions from Facebook or
Anchit wants to come back with some response.
Sure.
Thank you, ma'am, for giving me space. I want to continue some of because it was not possible to answer all the issues raised by Dr. Manisha Chaudhary, ma'am, and these are very important questions. One thing she mentioned was that OCR was not conducive for the breeding of camels. Now, I would like to respond on this through 2 points. A, if we look at the Marwar state records and the Jodhpur Pargana, the records of Jodhpur Pargana, the Tappa OCR from all of this, from whole of this Jodhpur Pargana, it mentions that the highest number of camels came from the Tappa OCR only. So in 17th century, now like I'll come on the question whether they were imported from somewhere or breeded there only, but definitely in 17th century and in 18th century, in whole of this Jodhpur Pargana, OCR had highest population of camels and of other animals also. Now, on the question whether they were breeded in the region of OCR or they were imported from somewhere else and were placed in OCR, and even if they were imported from somewhere else and placed in OCR, then that is also a very important question. Now, Dr. Manisha Chaudhary, ma'am, has mentioned in her book, and let me quote, the herding of camels required a specialized group of individuals like Rewardis and often necessitated nomadic ventures and open land areas where animals can pick twigs, leaves, and grasses. Now, the ecology, if we look at the ecological landscape of OCR, there is, and particularly in the outskirts region of OCR, there are lands, there are open areas which suits to that. And this made me recall of this of the reference in 13th century Mrik Pakshi Shastra. It informs that camels can grow abundantly in oases only. The most popular variety, Ustra, is described as one which likes desert and runs very fast in the desert. They at times like to go to forest also, which can be nothing other than a cluster of short trees of the arid. So it mentions that the best quality of camels come from such an arid place. They need such a secluded space. And Vajralagga also emphasizes on similar kind of things. For example, it mentions that the male camels enjoy the female ones in bushes, deserts, solitary and depressed places. Now, if one visits OCR, one would definitely find such places. And I'm unable to think of any reasons that camels were present in such a large number in this place, OCR, but were not breeded.
For that, because Anchit, let me tell you, in the 17th century especially, there's a lot of organization of camels and animals, especially in general, for all the states, because all of them are earning a lot of money from the camel fairs, cattle fairs, and large number of fairs are organized. So much so that in Ajmer itself, there were 14 to 15 cattle fairs, and that too in a year. और इसी से आई थिंक आप एक अंदाजा लगा सकते हैं कि कितने कैटल फेयर्स मरुस्थली में हुए होंगे और किस तरह से जैसलमेर ऑर्गेनाइज करता रहा होगा, एंड व्हाट इज देयर कनेक्टिविटी विद गुजरात एंड देन बियॉन्ड. Taking forward from Shalin sir also, as he said, pastoralism is well established, but for camel to say that Ossia in itself is not very conducive for the very simple reason because the dunes are very much into the Ossia. When you look at the Jaisalmer desert, the variety of the desert changes, and there the desert is much more vast, where the dunes are very tall, very huge, but again their pace is also very extensive. So camel requires that kind of thing in first place. Secondly, why there is a change in the variety when we talk of camels from Jaisalmer to Bikaner, and then altogether the Bhuri camel that comes from Badmer, which generally people talk that Pabuji got here, and there is an entire story to it. So there are varieties of camel, right? In Ossia, why I'm saying that they were kept there for the very simple reason because Ossia was a very major cross center, and from here people traveled long distances. It was a place from where people set on long journeys, right? For that matter, Badmer was not. For that matter, other places were not. Jodhpur was not. Jodhpur was only approached by people in order to refill the requirements of water. Now coming back to Ossia, if you see the I will say the water catchment areas of Ossia, you find they are very, very different in comparison of the ones which are there in the Jodhpur and Jaisalmer and Barmer, if you have traveled the region. Why is it so? Again, because they knew that this is the region, and again, see that all these regions, the water catchment areas are very low on the ground. Why? Because the camel and the cattle needs to reach the region to pick water and then come back. Wherein all the water catchment areas in the areas of Jaisalmer or to say Jodhpur, they have a high inundation on both the sides because those are the water areas reserved for human beings. So in this, why I'm saying Ossia is a place where they are keeping the cattle is because Ossia is a juncture for setting on long journeys. So they need to refill themselves here. They refill human requirements from Jodhpur and then, basically the Mandor, and then they refill the animal requirements in Ossia. They drop the animals which they have carried till there. And from here onwards, only exclusively camel is taken forward. And then again, the mode of transport changes when they cross over from the Sindh desert. When you read the history of Sindh or Tawarikh-e-Sindh, you will get to know about this also. And they say this has been continuing for very, very long in the same way. Interestingly, what you are saying is pastoralism is very well established in this region because there's no reason for us to deny it. And why? Because archaeological evidences are there, which clearly mention that yes, pastoralism, nomadism on large scale is there. The problem of the company with the region was again the same, that they cannot be surveillanced. And therefore, they never wanted to interact with the region directly. When Mahto Nancy talks about them, he says, yes, these fights of pastorals are continuing. In Jaisalmer, we have large number of evidences of cattle fights, the fights over the capture of, Champa and all. Again, Nandita Sahai has very well done the work on that, where she brings out the inscriptions. So that is there very much in the early medieval. My only thing about you is like, for camel, why I will say you should not, because very nearby you have Badmer, which provides the best variety. Then the next is Jaisalmer, which again supplies you the second good. And the last is Bikaner, which is for the huge stuff to be carried forward. Why you need to take Bikaner camel is because then you go towards the hilly areas. So that is the one major difference. And I will say, because literary evidence is something what is like, we create literature. Archaeology is not create. And the inscription in this region and the literature of the region is again, I will say, because in 18th century, large number of changes has been done by the Rajputs here. Because there was revivalism of Vaishnavism in these regions in the 18th century. And please remember, जिसे कहते हैं ना कि घर में बैठा के रिवाइव किया गया था लिटरेचर को कि जो भी हमारे फेवर में नहीं है उसको निकाल दो and please rewrite the entire thing. So I mean, Seema ma'am is there. I think she's attempting to come in. I will rest my say here only. So just take these things forward. I'm just saying that. I'm not objecting to what you want to perceive further. Ma'am, you are muted.
Yeah, I'm muted because my dog is playing with me. I'm really very happy that, the faculty is also pitching in and offering very, very valuable suggestions. So I think all of you should take those. And I think this has been a very, very fascinating beginning to the 2-day conference, which is very important. I think we'll take a break now so that the organizers also can have a kind of a breathing space. And please come back at 11:30 for the rest of the presentations. Thank you so much. Thank you.